Let's quickly cover a piece of the anatomy of your barbell that's important to know. Specifically, we're going to discuss the rings on your barbell, also known as the score marks or the neural marks on your bar, where they're located, what they're called, why they're important, and why not knowing this can potentially mess up your training, or even worse, if you're competing, it can mess up your competition. We've got 5 barbells here that we're going to look at. Specifically, we're going to look at these 3 bars. I may occasionally refer to these 2 bars up here. Let's start down here. You'll notice that this bar has the inner set of rings. These 2 rings right here, far left and far right over here, these are known as the powerlifting rings or the power rings. And because this bar just has those rings, this bar is commonly referred to as a powerlifting bar, or even more commonly, just a power bar. These rings are 81 centimeters apart, or essentially 32 inches apart. Now, if we jump past this bar, which obviously has both sets of rings, and we come up to this one up here, this is known as an Olympic weightlifting bar, more specifically just a weightlifting bar, but very commonly an Olympic lifting or an Olympic weightlifting bar. These rings, you'll notice, are a little bit wider. They are 91 centimeters apart, or essentially 36 inches apart. And then this type of bar, a hybrid bar or a bar that has both score marks, has become very, very common. You'll see this a whole lot. It has both sets of marks. Now, why are these marks important? Well, in the sport of powerlifting, you must cover up, when performing the bench press, you must cover up this ring with at least part of your hand when performing the bench press. In other words, it's a limit as to how wide your grip is legally allowed to go on the bench press. But even if you're not, even not for competition purposes, this is a very useful for the width of your grip. And likewise, in Olympic lifting, the grips in Olympic lifting, specifically the snatch, tend to be wider, right? So it's useful to have a wider reference mark when you're taking your grip for various lifts, such as the snatch, the clean, and the jerk. And that is the major point behind these score marks, right? It's so that you can have a consistent place to line up your grip, so that your technique can be consistent, so that hopefully your progress can be consistent as well. So we've got the power rings, we've got the weightlifting rings or the Olympic rings. This by the way, is an Olympic women's bar. So this is a 20 kilogram or 44 pound men's Olympic bar. This is a 15 kilogram or a 33 pound women's Olympic bar. This is a 10 kilogram bar. You'll notice again it's got both of the marks. But typically speaking, if you've got a pretty nice expensive weightlifting bar, in other words a bar that is dedicated to the sport of weightlifting, you're not going to see a bar that has dual marks. You're going to see a bar that just has single marks. So what's the risk if you don't know, which rings that you're using? Well, imagine that you train on a bar like this, and then you go. In other words, you train on a bar that has both sets of rings, and let's say for your squat or your bench press, you've been using the inside ring, just out of habit more than anything else. And then you go somewhere else, you go on vacation or something like that, and you go to train on a different bar, and you come across a bar that is this bar or this bar. You're not even sure which one it is, and there's the problem, right? You might not know which ring you've been using, and so now you show up to train somewhere else, or worse, you show up to compete somewhere else, and you go up to take your grip on the bar and you're not sure which set of rings you've been using, and so now your grip is going to be potentially inconsistent, which means potentially your technique is going to be inconsistent. You don't want to end up with a grip, like for example on your bench press or your clean, for instance, that is going to be 2 inches wider than it normally is, or 2 inches narrower than it normally is. Likewise, you could see this happening in reverse too, right? You've been training on a bar like this, and then you start competing or training on a bar like this, and you weren't sure which set of rings it was that you were actually using in the first place. You may not have even known that there were other rings potentially available to be on the barbell. So the kicker is, know the equipment that you're training on. Just once, it might be worth it to take a tape measure, figure out the distance between the rings, so you know what you're working on, so you know what you're training on. After that, of course, you could just measure based on your you could measure based on your own anatomy, so that if you go somewhere else, you know what you're using. For example, if you've been using this ring right here, then you can measure and say, okay, typically I'm using a ring that is about 1 hand width for my own hand. So if I go somewhere else and I measure that out and I say, okay, this is clearly a different style bar, so I may want to adjust my grip in accordingly or out accordingly. But know your equipment, know what you're training on. Now you do, so hopefully your technique can be consistent, so hopefully your progress can be consistent. As always, we hope this helps you get stronger and live better.